I said I would look into it. Unfortunately, I haven't had a chance. I mean, all I know is what you were told by the archaeologist, and I'll try to figure that out. Yeah.
When you say therapy is effective, I feel like a lot of religious people bash therapy and say like you should be able to do this on your own. And I'm just curious your thoughts.
Yeah, the question is, sometimes people feel they need therapy, and the question is that you might hear from a religious Jew, do it on your own, why are you going to therapy, etc. So there are a few things. First of all, it's very, very clear. The Rambam describes, as I mentioned today, that when there are afflictions of the soul, personality defects, bad middos, these are sicknesses of the soul. And the same way that you need a doctor of the body to instruct you how to take care of your body, you need a doctor of the soul to instruct you how to take care of your soul. Now, in the Rambam's context, that referred to Talmidei Chachamim, Tzadikim, who can give you refuas hanefesh. But we have to take it further. The Torah is the optimal diet, and the Torah is the optimal refuah for someone who is basically healthy. That if you are healthy, if you're a human being, if you are a person who is able to function well in society, the Torah will give you guidelines, the Torah will give you guidance, the Torah will give you direction, and that is really all you need. But the problem is that very often we are faced in a situation where we're not yet ready to be basic human beings. And the Torah was given to healthy people, and therefore sometimes, in order to get yourself to a place where you're able to keep Torah and you're able to absorb Torah and you're able to be elevated by Torah, you might need things like doctors, psychiatrists for medication, therapists for insight and understand yourself. Rav Chaim Vital, the great Talmud of the Ari, makes a very interesting observation. He points out that the Torah does not give you that many halachas about middos. Indirectly, the Torah says give tzedakah, but the Torah doesn't say directly, be kind, be good, be generous, be forgiving. Right? We talk about middos, but there's no mitzvahs in the Torah that are mechayev middos, other than the generic idea of trying to be like God. So why doesn't the Torah make a bigger deal about middos if they're so fundamental? You know what Rav Chaim Vital says? Rav Chaim Vital says, because middos are the foundation of a building. The Torah is the building. The Torah is the sulam, the ladder that connects you to God. The middos are the foundation. So the Torah starts with the building, but you have to have a foundation. Without that foundation, the building is going to collapse. And therefore, we sometimes need therapists that can give us an appropriate foundation. The Brisker Rav said it a little differently, but it's the same point. In fact, he probably based on Rav Chaim Vital. The Brisker Rav said the Torah was given to people. With bad middos, you're an animal. So the Torah is not shaykh to you, you're a behemoth. So the Torah doesn't begin. Now, so the notion of going to a therapist is not at all keneged the Torah. It's a very, very legitimate and proper response when a person is struggling. The question is, what type of therapist, what type of person do you go to? Now that's a very, very difficult question, because the last thing you need in therapy is a therapist whose value system is keneged the will of God and the rules of the Torah. I mean, suffice it to say that in our society, when I say our, I mean our general Western society, a lot of the general values of society are totally against the Torah. I mean, let's imagine, I'll give you a concrete example. Let's imagine a person is struggling with same-sex attraction. Now, I'm not trivializing it. I'm not going to, I know just to tell a person no, is not going to be so easy. But in the secular world, it's not a problem. There's no problem there. There's nothing to work on. He says, you want that? So have that. Now, that's not acceptable for a religious Jew. Now, again, I understand the struggle, and it is a struggle, and when one has to talk about it, and one has to work it out, it is not a small thing to be just dismissed. But what I'm saying is that there are going to be many inyanim in Judaism that, you have to work towards a particular goal that in regular therapeutic society is not even an issue. And that's where you get a problem. So my answer basically, I'm giving you a long-winded answer, my answer basically is there is nothing wrong and many things right in getting therapy. And you can't just say, be enough of a tzaddik and you'll heal yourself. We don't say that by physical illness. Yeah, the Ramban writes, if somebody is a real tzaddik, he doesn't need doctors. But the Shulchan Aruch paskins, if we're physically sick, we have to go to a doctor. Well, mental illness or mental difficulties are every bit as real as physical difficulties. So therapy can be a wonderful, wonderful thing, and it's not a failure. It'll be a siyua, an assistance in working on yourself in a good way. But you have to pick the right therapist, and you have to be sure that the value systems are in alignment, and that is a difficult challenge. So that part is a difficult piece to pick. Yeah.
Is one allowed to gamble in a casino or gamble amongst his friends, just privately?
Yeah, so, is one allowed to gamble in a casino or just friendly gambling with your friends? Is it mutter or not? This is actually a pretty complicated shaila. This is not so pashut. The Mishnah, many places in the Mishnah, Sanhedrin, Rosh Hashanah, talks about people who are pasol, they're not kosher to be witnesses. And it mentions mesachek b'kovia, which means people who play with dice, and mafriche yonim, and people who race pigeons. And the Gemara explains that these are gamblers. These are people who bet, right? The different games of chance, or pigeon races, or dove races, and the like. So gamblers, it says, are pasol li'edus. They cannot be kosher witnesses. So the Gemara then asks, why is a gambler, what's wrong with gambling? Why are you pasol li'edus? So the Gemara gives two reasons why a gambler is pasol to be a witness. One reason is a little complicated. It's called asmachta laikanya. And the concept is, when people make bets, the assumption is they're making a bet on the expectation they're not going to lose. And when they wind up losing, they're giving money that they really didn't want to give. So when you receive the money, it's ki'ilu, you're stealing from them, because they're giving you money that they never intended to have to pay. So therefore, you're pasol li'edus, because a gambler would be treated as a potential gazlan. Now, l'chayra, it's interesting. That would only be true if you win. If you always lose, you're not a guy. You didn't steal from anybody, right? Asmachta lekanya is a psul for somebody who gets money from gambling, not somebody who loses. Okay. Now, the other reason the Gemara gives would apply on either side of the equation, and that is a gambler is called eino osek biyeshuvo shel olam. He is not occupying himself with something constructive that adds value to the world. When I learn, of course I'm adding value. I'm learning, I'm bringing kedushin to the world. And when I run a business too, I'm adding value. Whether I'm a doctor, a lawyer, an accountant, a storekeeper, I'm doing something constructive to the world. Here, we're just betting around, and nothing of any chashivas is created. Now, so these are two reasons. Asmachta lekanya, the betting problem, which is gezela, and eino osek b'yeshuvo shel olam. Now, when the Gemara gives two reasons, it often says, my beinayu. What's the difference between the two reasons? Now here it doesn't say my beinayu, but the poskim say there's a my beinayu, and that is, what if you gamble, but that is not your whole parnasa? Meaning you have a parnasa and you also gamble. Like the first reason, esmachta, then even occasional gambling, you'll be pasol because you're a thief. Like the second reason, that you're not contributing to society, that would only apply to a person who 100% gets all of his income from gambling. It would not apply to the sporadic gambler. So it turns out that there is a machloket lahalacha, which reason of the Gemara we posken like. So at least according to the second reason, it would actually be mutter to sporadically gamble, like the gambling you're describing is sporadic. On the other hand, other poskim say it's kedai to be machmir. So as a general rule, we would say gambling would be usher. On the other hand, there are many, many ramifications, because gambling, I don't know if any of you are gamblers, I hope not. Gambling has there are many ways to gamble, many, many different ways to gamble. And some ways of gambling might in fact be mutter. For example, if you have to put the money down ahead of time, many Rishayim say there's no problem of esmachta because you've already parted with the money. that the isser of asmachta would only be if you're holding the money and then you lose and you have to pay. Masha Enkein, if you've parted with the money. So those types of gambling would only be usher because of the other reason. You're not Yeshe bi Isaac Bishu Shalem. And Memela, if it's not full time, right? So not full time where you put the money in, we actually would say it's going to be mutter. So you have to analyze every type of gambling. Now, there was a time-honored minhag, particularly among Hasidim, but among non-Hasidim as well, that during Hanukkah, people played dreidel, and where they gamble a little bit. Nittelnach, we talked a few weeks ago about Kratzmach night, where some had a minhag not to learn. They would also do gambling and the like. And again, the posken had criticisms of it, but they did come up with heterim. So b'derech klal, it seems, based on all of this lumdus, and it's a complicated thing, that the type of gambling where you put the money in a pot, you separate yourself from the money, and it's only sporadic and it's not large sums, there is a makom to be makel if you don't do it that often. But a lot of, is that all about gambling? Okay, yeah.
Just to add on to that, you said sporadic gambling would be mutter, but full-time gambling would be usher. Why? What's the difference? Are you allowed to puzzle yourself to be an aid?
No, you're not allowed to puzzle. What I was saying is, though, that the Gemara gave two reasons why a gambler is puzzle. And the first reason is because you're a thief, because you're collecting on a bet. The second reason is because you're not doing anything productive in the world. Now, if you're not a full-time gambler, you are doing something productive.
But
so
the reason that mattered was only in the context of being a witness. If you...
No. But keep. I understand. And you're asking me, why would that be something usher to do? You're asking. Yes. Okay, so like the first reason it would be usher because you're a thief. Oh, so you're asking me just because the consequence is your puzzle le'edus, why does that translate in making you forbidden to do it? That's what you're asking. That's a very good point. The assumption has to be this: not that it's usher to make yourself puzzle to edus, but it's usher to make yourself a person who is so useless that you're pasoliatus. Now, the problem is not your pasoliatus. The problem is a mensch is not supposed to make himself worthless. So now you're going to ask me, what pasuk? Again, where does it say that? Where does it say a person can't make himself useless? That's a good point. It seems to be a svara. It seems to be implicit in the notion that a human is made in the image of God. Says you got to do something useful with your life. Now, I want to admit, and this is something that needs a lot of analysis, and we actually could use economists. I know Rabbi, Masha Shapiro was talking to me about it. He wanted to write a paper on it. And that is, it's hard to fully understand why gambling, in a commercial sense, is considered to be such a worthless activity. I mean, you can have big companies that employ, hundreds of people, and the hundreds of people get salaries from it, and they support their families. I mean, what are you going to say? Because it's only entertainment, it's only gambling? Well, what about, stamazai entertainment? I mean, there's plenty of things that we would call are kind of worthless, but we don't automatically say they make a person pasoliatus. So, like the first reason that they're taking money, bigizela, right, that would apply. But just the stamazai say, this is a worthless, non-productive activity when on a commercial basis it can benefit many, many people. It's a bit of a tzarachian, and it could be because Chazal, we're not talking about commercial gambling. Chazal, we're talking about these private bets, which is just moving money from me to you, etc. But one could make the argument that a casino bichlal is called yishuvo shel olam, and the only problem is a smachta, and that would depend on whether you put your money down. So this needs a tzarachian, and there's other tzarachians too. Because what's gambling? There's a lot of stuff that are regular commercial transactions that are fundamentally gambling. Hedge funds, day trading, playing the stock market. What are you doing? You're putting money down, gambling that the price will rise, and maybe you'll lose, maybe you'll win. So what are you going to say? I mean, gambling? I mean, what defines gambling? I mean, we know that some things we call gambling. I call a casino gambling, and I call hedge funds investing. right? You got to be masber taka. So it's a very, very complicated question. But the bottom line is, as I say, sporadic, low amount gambling, where you put your money in a pot, there's a makom to matter then. Yeah.
Excluding mesora, how should one know whether to follow the Orach Hashulchan or the Mishna Berura? Obviously, considering Ashkenazi.
Yeah. This is again an interesting question. We have in the late 19th century, almost at the same time, they came out overlapping volumes. Two great codes by two Gedolei HaPoskim. We have the Mishna Berura of the Chafetz Chaim, which is only on Orach Chaim, only on the first part of the Shulchan Aruch. And then we have the Orach Hashulchan from Rabbi Chiel Michael Epstein on everything, not just Orach Chaim, but Yoredeya, Ibn Ezer, Choshen Mishpat, and even Orach Hashulchan Ha'asid. He even wrote, that was printed later, on Zeraim and Kutchim and Taros. He mamish wrote everything at all. Now, it's interesting that, I don't want to overemphasize the machloket. I would say that probably 80%, 85% are exactly the same. It's not like they argue on every little thing, but there are significant differences in psak. Usually the Welt likes to say that the Orach Hashulchan tends to be more makil than the Mishna Berura. That's not quite true. One very big difference is this. The Orach Hashulchan was more deferential to minhag than the Mishna Berura. So if the minhag was makel, the Orach Hashulchan was makel. If the minhag was machmer, the Orach Hashulchan was machmer. The Mishna Berura wanted to go back to the original texts and come out. Now what's interesting is, people say that that's the way he wrote the Mishna Berura. He wanted to base everything on sources, but in the Chafetz Chaim's own personal life, he followed the minhagim. In other words, he felt in a sefer of halacha, he has to go through what the halacha should be. In fact, in actual life, he followed that. Now, but be it as it may, another difference between the Mishna Berura and the Orach Hashulchan is that the Chafetz Chaim, who wrote the Mishna Berura, actually he didn't write it himself, it was almost by committee. The Chafetz Chaim we would call the editor-in-chief of the Mishna Berura. The Mishna Berura was written by his sons and sons-in-law and different parts, and that's why there are sometimes contradictions in the Mishna Berura, and one of the answers is written by two different rabbis, so to speak. But be it as it may, whether it's the Chafetz Chaim is called the editor or the author, one characteristic of the Mishna Berura is that the Chafetz Chaim does not like to be machriya when there's a machloket posken. By that I mean, if you have the Magen Avraham and the Taz and others, so the Mishna Berura will commonly give you a way to be yotzei everybody. If you do it this way, you'll be yotzei this, you'll be yotzei this, yotzei this, and we don't have to decide which one is right. In other words, this is the famous yotzei all of the deis. And the Mishna Berura does that 1,000,000 times. The Orach Hashulchan has no hesitation in just telling you what he thinks is right. Machloket, Magen Avraham and Taz, you say, Taz is wrong, Magen Avraham's right, let's go on, Prima Gada. So the Orach Hashulchan is machriya more than the Mishna Berura, because the Mishna Berura likes to have an eitzah to be yotzei all of the, sometimes very complicated, but you want to be yotzei all of the death. So those are some differences between them. It is said, I was not there, it is said that in Europe before World War II, or in Lithuania at least, he says the Orach Hashulchan was considered to be the posek acharon, the definitive posek. Even after the Mishna Berura came out, the Orach Hashulchan was more makubal in the yeshiva world as the final definitive posek. Bisman hazeh, it seems to have gone the other way, with the Mishna Berura being considered to be the definitive posek, and some credit that. There are two in Eretz Yisrael. The shorish of that is the Chazon Ish, who writes in one of his igros. He talks about the tradition of mesora, and he says we have Moshe Rabbeinu and Yehuda HaNasi and Ravina and Ravashi and the Rambam and the Tur and the Shulchan Aruch and the Chafetz Chaim. Like he puts the mamish as a chelik of the mesora. And in the United States, it was Aaron Cutler. Aaron Cutler was very responsible for elevating the Mishna Berura. If you see pictures of Aaron at chasanas, you will always see him holding a Mishna Berura, And he holds it in such a way that you can see the title of it on the picture. Now, I don't want to be cynical, but some have suggested Rav Aaron deliberately wanted to be photographed with a Mishna Berura to kind of instill in his Talmidim that the Chafetz Chaim was the Paisek Acharon. So there are differences here. So your question is, again, a long introduction. So your question basically is, how does a person know? The answer is a person doesn't know. All of us are supposed to have Rabbeim, and we follow the mesora of our Rabbeim as to what we should do. But I can tell you this, if a person were to follow the Orach Hashulchan, or a person were to follow the Mishna Berura, after 120 years, you will be on safe ground. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is not going to taina on you, why did you follow the Orach Hashulchan? The Orach Hashulchan was a tremendous gaon. We don't even realize how great he was. And the Chafetz Chaim is actually more famous today, and the Chafetz Chaim is the Chafetz Chaim. So the truth of the matter is, I wouldn't worry about it so much. But it is an interesting question, how in the yeshiva world, the classic sefer changed. Yeah?
Rambam Paskins, I think this is a halacha that we're not allowed to step into churches for whatever reason. We are allowed to step into mosques because of the whole thing of Christianity being kashash by Yisrael.
Yeah.
So I have a question. If a Jew is visiting someone like Rome or something where they have places like Sistine Chapel, which is people don't go inside it for religious services usually anyways, they're going inside it to appreciate art or whatever the reason might be, or you have a place like that. What would be the din in that scenario? Is there any difference between that and the Rambam, or is it the same thing across the board?
Right. So I'll just repeat the question. The question basically is that it is a halacha, not only the Rambam, the Shulchan Aruch paskins, that we are not allowed to enter a place of avodah zarah, even if we're not going to worship it, because this is marisayin. Marisayin. People see you entering a place of avodah zarah, they're going to think that you might be worshiping it, and therefore you cannot enter a makam of avodah zarah. The Rambam is masber, however, that you are allowed to enter a mosque, an Islamic place, because Islam is not idolatry. Islam is many negative things that we don't like. But the good thing, the one thing they're not if they have avodah zarah, and memela you're allowed to enter a mosque. In fact, when you go to Hebron and you go to the Maras HaMachpelah, you're actually entering a mosque in order to daven at the kavarim of the avos. A church, we treat Christianity as idolatry. Now, again, don't confuse this. There is a machloket rishonim if Christianity is idolatry for a non-Jew. Rabbeinu Tam famously says it's not avodah zarah for a non-Jew under the 7 commandments of Noach. The Rambam actually holds it is avodah zarah even for a non-Jew. But akol modim, that's a machlokas with respect to non-Jews and the 7 Noachide laws. With respect to me as a Jew, Christian worship is 100% idolatrous. And when I say Christian, I know Christian has a wide variety of beliefs, but really, virtually every type of Christianity, certainly Trinitarian Christianity, maybe Unitarianism might be the only one that isn't, but everything else is avodah zarah. So that's why I'm not allowed to enter a church. So the question becomes, what about things that may officially be churches, but people visit them not for worship, people visit them because of the art, because of the beauty. The Sistine Chapel, you have on the ceiling, you have, I was not in the Sistine Chapel, but you have on the ceiling Michelangelo's things about creation of the world and other things. Even Notre Dame, which had a big fire a few years ago, people want the art and the like. So if you're going in for artistic reasons, is that going to be permitted? So first of all, let me raise a preliminary question. Forget about Marasayan. If you're not allowed to get benefit from idolatry, are you allowed to enjoy the beautiful art? Even if I'm looking at a picture of the Sistine Chapel, right? Am I getting benefit from avodah zarah by my re'iyah of avodah zarah? It's an opposite question. That you're assuming the re'iyah is mutter, and you're just asking me, can I enter the church? One might even ask, are you allowed to even enjoy the re'iyah? That's a very difficult question. It's not so pashut. why you would be allowed. But let's assume for a moment that there's no Avera per se. Let's say I'm standing outside and I'm admiring something. There's no Avera in enjoying the art. So the question is the Knesset going to be mutter? So Vatican City, right? I mean, all of Vatican City is that way. It's one big church. So some want to differentiate, let's say, between the Sistine Chapel and St. Peter's Basilica. The Sistine Chapel services for the public are not held at all. The Sistine Chapel, I believe, is the Pope's private thing. I think. I'm not sure. If that's the case, then there's never a Maris Ayin that you're going in to worship because people cannot come in to worship. Masha Ein Kain, a church which is used for services, even if you're going in just to admire the art, you still have a Maris Ayin because people also go in to worship. So the point would be, therefore, that the Sistine Chapel might have become a museum as opposed to Peter's Basilica, which is still a functioning church. And that's why Notre Dame would be usher, because the Cathedral of Notre Dame, even though many, many people go in to admire the art, but it is a functioning church that still has religious services. So there you'd have to be strict. Now, it's interesting, Baruch Hashem, we don't have this problem in Eretz Yisrael so much, but in the States, churches are used for a lot of other things that are not connected to churches. For example, a lot of voting. If you're voting for a presidential election or whatever it is, the voting booths may be in the basement of the church. Churches rent out rooms to various professionals. There are therapists who rent rooms or offices in churches. So you have all sorts of shilas. Can I go to my therapist if that means I enter a church to go to his office, right? Can I vote in a church? So there you do have different shilas. Rav Moshe seems to suggest that as long as you don't enter the sanctuary proper. See, I don't know how that addresses Maris Ayin, because people from the outside see you going into the building. They don't know what part of the building. But Rav Moshe is mechalek between going into the sanctuary and going into the side rooms of a church, where he suggests if there's a legitimate secular tzorech, you are allowed to go to the side room. So you can go to your therapist in the church, you can vote in the basement of a church, and the like. Now, it could be Rav Moshe is talking about only because if there's a different entrance, meaning it depends on the building. Sometimes the idea is you are entering the main entrance and then you turn. That may be a problem. Other times it's bedafka, a side entrance. So it's nikar mibachutz, that you're not entering the sanctuary. So it could be, I have to see the lashon of the tshuva, that Rav Moshe's heter may only be if there's a side entrance, so anyone seeing you from the outside knows you're not entering the place of worship. Now, let me mention a little shaila. Last year, we lost a chashuv person, a person a little controversial, but who did a lot for the Jewish people, Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, Zichrono Livracha, and he had been chief rabbi of United Kingdom for a number of years, etc. And the last royal wedding, William and Kate, so they always have their weddings in Westminster Abbey. That's the main church there. And Rabbi Sachs went to the chasna. He went to the wedding, right? He sat at the wedding because officially, he works for the queen, etc. So the question becomes, well, gee, is there a heter? What gives him the heter to go into a church? And it's much worse than your shaila. It's not even going into a church to see the art. He's going into a church for a religious ceremony, a wedding with all the yachka and everything, all the priests and all the bishops, and he's sitting there. So what's the heter? So they bring from a sugya and Maseches Avodah Zarah that there actually is a heter to enter a Beis Avodah Zarah for people who are karev l'malchus. As I had your karev l'malchus. Karev l'malchus means that they are emissaries for the Jewish people working, and they have to be close to the monarch in order to get benefits for Klal Yisrael. And Mimela, if they antagonize the monarch, there may be bad things. Now, to do real avodah zarah, that's your hard val yavar, even if they're going to kill you. And so we're not saying karev l'malchus, you're allowed to do avodah zarah. Of course not. That's obvious. But if it's only a question of a maris ayin and entering, so we have a hedra karev l'malchus. So the question is, Rabbi Sachs made the argument, or actually I don't know if he made the argument, people were arguing on his behalf. I don't think he addressed it. He's karev l'malchus, but it's hard to compare a milsa to milsa. In the olden days, if you got the king angry, they would kill you, and maybe they'll kill 1 million Jews. I mean, here, it's not like Queen Elizabeth is going to, do anything to you if you didn't go to the wedding of William and Kate. So it's not so pashut you could invoke a heter of karev l'malchus bisman hazeh when the melech has no real power to hurt you in any way. But that's an interesting shayla, huh?
It takes away from the Maras Ayin. Everybody knows
It could be, because this was an official position. And by the way, Rabbi Sachs was not the first one. I don't want to say for sure, but it may be that Lord Jacobowitz, Zichron Lebracha, was actually more a shtickle more charedi, as it were. I think did the same thing, and he actually wrote that he held he had a heter of karev l'malchus. So that's an interesting question.
These powdered soups, sometimes they come in plastic containers, and also in the packets that are dried. In Israel, is it permissible to use them on Shabbat with the kli shlishi? That's a difficult question. You have the soups, whether it's osem, manachama, or American tradition soup, or whatever it is, right? You pour hot water on them, and the question obviously becomes, is there an iser of bishul, right? Whenever you apply hot liquids to something that's not completely cooked, you have a problem of cooking on Shabbos. So are you allowed to prepare these soups? So the way these soups are is the soups are partially cooked, but not completely. The hot water completes the process. So you start off with, it would be usher, right? So the question then becomes, okay, it's usher. It's usher for me to pour directly from an urn or from a kettle onto the soup, because the urn or the kettle is called a kli rishon. It was on the heat source. And when I pour from the kli rishon, that's iroi kli rishon. And we posken la halacha that iroi kli rishon on something that's not completely cooked is going to be usher. And even kli sheni would be, I pour the hot water in this cup. This cup is a kli sheni, and then I dump the soup or the mix into it. Even a kli sheni, we do aser because of a chashash that some of these ingredients may be called kale bishul. Kale bishul are things that are easily cooked, and that's aser even in a kli sheni. So that much I can tell you for sure. You cannot pour from the urn, and you cannot even pour the contents of the soup mix into a kli sheni, right? And from your question, I knew that you knew that. The question becomes, do I have a heter of one step further called kli shlishi? Okay, the urn, right? The urn is rishon, right? I fill up the cup with water. This is sheni. I pour it into the next one. That is shlishi. Can I then put the dry soup mix into a kli shlishi or revi, chamishi, or the like? So this is, again, a big machloket on posken. The Gemara never makes any reference at all to kli shlishi. Right? There's never a distinction. But Rav Moshe says, me'ikar hadin, even if we're machmir, that we treat things as easily cookable, and therefore you're not allowed to put them in a kli sheni. But Rav Moshe says, me'ikar hadin, once it's kli shlishi, there is never any bishul in a kli shlishi. And Rav Moshe at least says me'ikar hadin, although he himself said he was machmer, me'ikar hadin, you could put even raw vegetables, and kal v'chomer, something partially cooked, you can put it in a kli shlishi. So according to Rav Moshe, it would be mutter, but there are two qualifications I have to put in. Number one, there is a shita of the Chaye Adam. Now the Chaye Adam, very important Pesach, Rav Avraham Danzig, the Chaye Adam was a mechutin of the Vilna Gaon. Their children married each other. I don't know
I think it was the Chai Adam's daughter and the Gra's son, may be in reverse. The Chai Adam was a businessman, actually. It's very interesting. I mean, he made a parnasa through business, but he was obviously a great Talmud Chacham, and he's considered to be one of the Gedolei HaPoskim. The Chai Adam makes a very interesting distinction. He says, he says, like Rav Moshe said later, that a Kli Shlishi is not Mavashel. He did say that, but he said that just means it's not Mavashel at the minimal temperature of Yad Soledespay. I'll explain the terms, but it is Mavashel at a higher temperature of Yad Nichvespay. Now let me explain this, because this might be an unfamiliar term. Yad Soledespay literally means when your hand touches it, it would pull away. And that's usually around a temperature of 110 degrees approximately. And that is the normal temperature of halachic cooking. Any temperature that's less than Yad Soledespay is not a halachic cooking temperature. So the Chai Adam says, like Rav Moshe says, that a Kli Shlishi is not Mavashel at the temperature of Yad Soledespay. But Yad Nichvespay is a much higher temperature. That's your hand would be burnt. If you touch it, not only would it pull away, it would actually be burnt, and that may be approaching boiling point, like 200 or whatever it is. And the Chai Adam says any leniency of Kli Shlishi would only be between Yad Soledespay and Yad Nichvespay, but there would be no leniency for Yad Nichvespay. So the problem is, water that comes out of an urn might actually be the shear of Yad Nichvespay. That's one thing. And the other thing is, some poskim say that Kli Shlishi, Kli Revi, Kli Chamishi, Kli Shishi is all the same as Kli Sheni. There's only Kli Rishon, and everything else is Kli Sheni. And they would ask her. So all I can tell you is that it would be a machloket. There is a makom to be makel like Rav Moshe, but many would be machran. Yeah.
Is the material you're saying has a different deen than say like coffee, like instant coffee, which is or something like this, or is it the same?
No. Okay. The issue we just discussed is the same for tea leaves. Tea leaves and instant soup are essentially the same shaila. Tea leaves, because they're not completely cooked. Instant coffee is a different problem, because there the coffee has in fact been totally cooked or roasted. It's been roasted already. So the problem there simply is you're doing cooking after cooking. And that's going to be permitted in a Kli Sheni. So instant coffee and instant tea you can make in a Kli Sheni. But that's a different shaila, because there you're not dealing with cooking, you're dealing with cooking after cooking.
So somehow they took like the tomato juice or whatever was in it and dehydrated it somehow without cooking it?
Well, no.
How do they do that?
No, it was partially cooked, meaning to say not completely cooked. And besides, there are other ingredients, meaning in this soup mix, there are ingredients that may have been totally cooked, you're right, but there are ingredients that were not totally cooked, right? The noodles, for example, it's very clear that the noodles are not totally cooked because they're still hard, right? So that's where you get a problem. So it is not the same as instant coffee and instant tea. It is the same as a tea bag. That is indeed the same. Yeah.
In regards to the Sistine Chapel, is there no issue with giving color to a monkey that represents?
That is another issue. The issue is going into the Sistine Chapel, are you giving homage? Are you giving honor? Are you showing respect to Avodah Zarah? And would that be a separate issue? It's a good point, but on the other hand, we do have a raya from the Mishnah that itself is mutter. The Mishnah discusses in Maseches Avodah Zarah various fountains that the Romans built throughout Eretz Yisrael, fountains of Venus that would sprout out water in gardens and parks. And the Gemara indicates that you were allowed to kind of go there because you're going there because you like the beauty, whatever it is, and that's not called giving homage. Now, maybe you're going to be mechalik, that maybe going into the building might be different than admiring things from the outside.
Would that also be a riot than the Rigas?
Well, yeah, it's a kasha. That is a raya is mutter, but it's a little bit of a kasha. Why is it mutter? It's not so pashut. Now, let me just mention something the Chazon Ish says, a very interesting chiddush, but it doesn't help for this at all. The Chazon Ish discussed a different shaila, but it's a related shaila, about going into the old temples of the Greeks. Like in Athens, you have a place called the Acropolis. It's a decaying temple, but there's like a certain beauty there and the like. So the Chazon Ish was machadesh that any avodah zara that is no longer worshipped at all is treated as nullified. And therefore the Chazon Ish says, I can go into these old Greek temples. I can go, there's no Marasayan, right? No one's going to think, oh, I'm going in to bring a korban to Jupiter or Zeus. You know what I mean? There's nobody who does that anymore. There probably is some people who do it, but a normal person doesn't do that. So the Chazon Ish gives a big heter for all of the defunct religions that are no longer being practiced anymore. But that's not a heter at all for Christianity. Christianity is unfortunately alive and well. So that Chazon Ish is not going to help you on the issue of Re'iyah. But I used it as a header. Somebody asked me, talking about a fundraising, Easter Island. I don't know Easter Island. Easter Island is like 500 miles off the coast of something. I don't know, is it South America or Africa? So it's off South America, right? Yeah. So Easter Island has these old, ancient statues of avodah zara, like gigantic things. So I think Torah in Ecuador or something, or Venezuela, wanted to do a fundraiser to kind of take a trip out, take a sea voyage to Easter Island and admire the monuments. So somebody sent me a shaila, are we allowed to kind of, go there? These monuments are avodah zara. Are we allowed to kind of take a trip to Easter Island? So, I didn't think it was the best place to go, but al pi the Chazon Ish, it would actually be mutter. So Easter Island is okay, but Sistine Chapel may be more of a shaila. But you do have a raya from that Gemara that even because the Mishnah was written at a time when those things were active avodah zara, and afilu hachi, it seems to matter the re'iyah. So that's going to be a kasha taka. But yeah, the Chazon Ish basically says that once the avodah zara is nisbatal min ha'olam, there's no isur hana, there's no isur minah. It's mamish nisbatal legamri. Yeah.
I don't know if Rebbe could define the term of Bitul Torah, because I'll speak with that in a very harsh and strong way, and I just want to know to what extent it's applied and what exactly it means.
Yeah, the question is there a definition we could give of Bitul Torah? Because Bitul Torah, if you take it to a real extreme, kind of, gets everybody in big, big trouble. The Vilna Gaon, it is said, would do tshuva because he made a cheshbon that in a given year he was mevatel Torah for 5 minutes or whatever. And I assure you, the 5 minutes was probably not Bitul Torah either. And different gedolim have different standards. Rebbe Yashiv, for example. Rebbe Yashiv is not the Vilna Gaon. Rebbe Yashiv is our generation. So Rebbe Yashiv would answer shilas a large part of the day. And at some point he said, I have to stop because I have to learn. I can't have a whole day without learning. So someone said to him, what do you mean a whole day without learning? The whole day you were answering shilas. He says, that's Haitianish learning. That's not learning. Learn, answer shilas, whatever it is. Learning is when I can mamish focus. So you see that Bitul Torah has many levels. Even a person who is answering shilas all day in halacha, that's also Bitul Torah. Or they bring a raya, in the yeshivas, they used to bring a raya. The Rosh Yeshiva, I heard it from my Rosh Yeshiva, Rav Ruderman, Zechreinu Livracha, who was a Talmud of the Alter Slobodka, and Rav Moshe Mordechai Epstein in Slobodka, right? He was a Talmud of Slobodka. That Rav Moshe Mordechai famously says that even if you learn Torah, but you're not learning it at the depth that you're capable of learning it, that's called Bitul Torah. What's his raya? His raya is from a Gemara in Megillah, coming up Purim. The Gemara in Megillah says, Mevatlin Talmud Torah, Likreis Megillah. That if I'm learning, and it's time to hear Megillah, I am mevatel my Torah learning to hear Megillah. That's the language of the Gemara. You're mevatel your Torah learning. So the kasha is, why do you call that Bitul Torah? Megillah is a book of Tanach. If I pull out a Tanach and I learn Megillah Esther, I'm learning Torah. So why is it called Mevatel in Talmud Torah? So Rav Moshe Mordechai says, you see from here, that if I was learning something in depth, and now I'm going to learn it superficially, because obviously even if I'm learning the Megillah as it's being read, I'm not learning the Megillah be'iyun, because I'm just listening to it very quickly. That's called Bitul Torah. Right? So you see, Bitul Torah has many definitions. A person who poskens all day can be called Bitul Torah, etc. In fact, by the Vilna Gaon, they tell a cute story. I think I may have mentioned it before. That the Vilna Gaon only slept, again, I'm giving a long answer. The Vilna Gaon only slept 2 hours a night for most of his life, and it was only in 4 half-hour increments. He never slept more than 30 minutes at a time. So once he went to a chasna, which he didn't do too often, in a city outside of Vilna, and he was given a room, and of course until the chasna mamish, he was learning before, after, etc. And people would charge admission. There was some guy who tried to make money. He had a ladder, and he would give you, for a ruble, you could watch the Vilna Gaon for 5 minutes. He didn't tell the Gra this, but just you could watch the Vilna Gaon sleep, or whatever it would be. So it's recorded that the Vilna Gaon was taking a nap, was taking one of his half-an-hour naps, and people were watching just to see the Kadesh, the Vilna Gaon sleeping. Tremendous thing. And all of a sudden, the Vilna Gaon gets up very agitated because it was 31 minutes instead of 30. And the Vilna Gaon started crying and sobbing. He didn't know anybody was watching him. He says, "Ay, what have I done with my life? How could I have come here? This is a sleepy city. It made me sleep. It took away my minutes. What could I do?" And it mentions that the whole city was sebracha, and the whole city was sad. They took away the Vilna Gaon's minutes. Now, the next time the Vilna Gaon came to the city was 30 years later for another chasna, and he only slept 29 minutes. And he got up and he says, "Baruch Hashem, HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave me back my minutes." And the whole city was happy. There were Zakanim who remembered 30 years before. And Baruch Hashem, Ha'ir, Tzahala v'samecha. Everybody was happy. Okay, but realistically, what is Bitul Torah for us? So it's very, very hard to be magdir. It's very, very clear that one should learn Torah whenever there's not something else that they need to do. Now, need to do is a tricky thing. A person needs to eat healthy meals. A person needs to have an adequate amount of sleep. We recognize that a person has a heter to be osek in parnasa, to support his family. That is Rabbi Yishmael's teaching, that the Torah maters parnasa, and by extension, again, these are all questionable, we matter the education that you need for parnasa. And I will even say, although you might consider this to be a kalas reich, but it really is not, that we also need time for a certain amount of relaxation and exercise, whether that means sleeping, jogging, playing basketball, reading books that are kosher, but not necessarily Toradic books. So, and the Rambam writes this beferish, that a person sometimes is nervous, is tense, needs to relax, needs to take time off. So a person who takes time off for recreation, for the purpose of renewing their strength and their energy to learn, that is not called Bitul Torah. So we have parnasa, we have the physical needs of the body, we have sleep, we have exercise, we have diet, we have recreation within reason, and we also have the chiyuvim of husband and wife and father towards children. A husband's obligations towards his wife, the Torah says there are 3 obligations that a husband has towards his wife. She'er ksus, that's food and clothing, that's support. Right? The husband is obligated to support his wife unless she is mocheles by kolel and the like. And the third is ona. Now, ona literally does mean marital intercourse, tashmish. But the Svarim say that aina is lav dafka, only marital intercourse. Aina is showing affection, care, and concern. That's why even when a woman is a nida, there's a chiyuv of aina but the aina is not going to be done in a physical way. It'll be done in a non-physical way. So the amount of time that a person spends with his wife, because she needs him, not just for physical things, but she needs him also for emotional support, is also not nichlal in Bitul Torah. Now, again, within reason. I mean, if your wife needs, 10 hours a day, well, if it's a short-term emergency, that's fine. If it's a long-term, 10 hours a day, there's a little bit of a problem. One has to adjust it in that way. But I sometimes get a question. A guy gets married and he asks me, "How many minutes am I allowed to talk to my wife?" That's not a good question. That's not a wise question. There's a certain amount of common sense in which that a man who marries is supposed to be a good husband. A ben Torah is supposed to be a good husband. A good husband is someone who makes himself available to talk to his wife. So my point is, it's a long answer to your question, all of those inyanim are not Bitul Torah because they are legitimate things HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants us to do. Other than that, you're supposed to learn. Other than that, we're supposed to learn when we're not involved in all of these other inyanim. But there are many inyanim that a person is supposed to be involved in. You will see, b'derech klal, I don't want to make it 100% generalization, but you will see among the great Talmidei Chachamim, the Gedolim, you will see a shalom bayis. You will see the concept of a family life, of talking to their spouse, interacting, honoring their spouse, being involved with their children. It is not the derech of a ben Torah to be marachek himself from caring about his family. That's not a good midah. And sometimes you get the impression that's what you're supposed to do. Sometimes they tell you stories that aren't so healthy. Oh, this rabbi is so great, he didn't know the name of his son. Or this rabbi is so great that, he didn't know how many daughters he had. And that's sometimes held up. First of all, the stories are usually not true. They're probably not true. But they're held up as a role model. So a guy gets married and says, I'm not going to, ever talk to my daughters because so-and-so gadol didn't talk to... that's not the derech. You have to be a family person too. Yeah.
The qualitative Bitul Torah discussion,
yeah.
Where does that leave room for learning, let's say, Tanach or Halacha or?
Oh no, so that's a separate.
You're not using all your kova in some way.
Okay, so you're asking me if that's only a kasha like of Moshe Mordechai. I mean, if I say that it's only called learning, if I'm doing it maximum bein, so where's the role for Bekiyas? Where's the role for Tanach? Where's the role for Chumash? All of these inyanim, which are less be'iyun, that's a good kasha. But once again, given the fact that there is a mitzvah to know Torah, not just learn Torah, but to know Torah, so memela, I have to learn all of those areas, and that's part of my chiyuv too, right? So you have to balance the chiyuvim. Remember that there is a din that the Rambam brings. Nobody keeps this din, but it's a din from the Gemara, that a person should divide his learning in thirds. A third of your time should be on the written Torah. That would be Tanach, Torah Nevi'im Kesuvim. A third of your time on Mishnah, which probably means halacha, practical halacha. And a third of your time on Gemara, which is defined as in-depth study. So Mishnah and Gemara does not mean exactly what it means today, but Mishnah meant halacha pesuka, and Gemara meant Havana. And the Rambam says, that's B'tchilas Limuda. Once you've mastered Tanach and Halacha, then you can spend all your time on Gemara. Okay, but we never get to that level, right? So really, realistically speaking, all of us should be on the idea of splitting your day in thirds. Because all of us are B'tchilas Limuda. Nobody does that. No, that's a kasha. I'm not going to answer why nobody does that. But the point is, you see from that halacha that division is vaday, not Bitul Torah. Meaning, if somebody wanted to do that, I can't tell him it's asur, because he's doing what the halacha says to do. It's a kasha on us that we don't do what the halacha says to do. Right? So you see that there has to be room for all of these areas of Torah. Yeah.
I was curious as to your opinion of censorship, meaning not just something getting completely blacklisted, which has happened. There are certain, publishing houses that
edit certain perushin and pull out
Yeah.
certain like things. Like one example is permissible, reading a newspaper on Shabbos.
Yeah. This is a fascinating issue. The issue of censoring svarim, or books, which are written about Gedolim, or even written by Gedolim, because they contain some ideas that seem to be controversial and maybe not fitting the normal model of yeshiva life, and therefore we just take it out. Take it out. There are so many examples. This is very, very fascinating. One example, I'll give you one example. One example goes all the way back to the Rishonim. We have the Rashbam. The Rashbam is Rashi's grandson. The Rashbam is a great Rishon. So the Rashbam wrote a Perish on Chumash too, right? In Mikros Gedolos, there's Perish or Rashbam. It's interesting. It's so different. The Rashbam on Gemara, which we have for most of Bava Basra and Arvei Psachim, Rashbam is tremendously marich, very, very long in expressing himself. In the Chumash, it's exactly the opposite, very, very concise. But in the Rashbam, in Bereshis, the Rashbam actually says, according to the Pashut Pshat of the Pasuk, the halachic definition of a day is a day followed by a night, which is keneged the mesora of Chazal, that it's the night followed by a day. And the Rashbam says he's not going to change the halacha, but he says, in the simple meaning of the pasuk, he says a unit of a day is morning and evening. So, when Art Scroll, and by the way, I have tremendous admiration for Art Scroll. I mean, we love to knock Art Scroll. We find criticisms. I mean, they're tremendous. I have not translated the Babylonian Talmud and the Yerushalmi. All the people who knock Art Scroll, they have not done a tiny fraction of what Art Scroll has done for Klal Yisrael. So everything I say is said with a great deal of kavod and a great deal of respect. That's very important to say. But when Art Scroll published a Mikros Gedolos on Bereshis that included the Perish of the Rashbam, they just took it out. They took it out. They said, it's apikorsis, kfira, we really, can't put it in. Apikorsis? You're censoring the Rashbam? Yeah, you have kashas on the Rashbam. Have kashas, have terutzim, be mafalpel, even put a footnote. If you want to put a footnote and say, this statement of the Rashbam is very difficult and was not makobel, okay, you can do that. But how do you just take it out? Now that's an extreme example because that's the Rashbam mamish. I mean, the Rashbam, how can you fool around with that? All right, so Art Scroll says, some people say it was a forgery. Okay, whatever. Okay, that's another mouth. Sometimes people say that. If a Rishon says something that you don't like, it's vaday a forgery. Okay, there was no raya that it's a forgery. Okay. Another example, a much later example, maybe not as severe. There was a great guy who was nifter in the 1970s here in Eretz Yisrael, Rav Shlomo Yosef Zevin, who was a big guy, big Talmud Chacham, but he happened to be, he was both Chabad and Mizrahi. He was like in everything. He was friendly with the Brisker Rav and the Chazon Ish and Rav Herzog and Rav Kook already. He was a rare person who mamish befriended everybody, and he was a big guy. And he wrote a beautiful sefer called, many svarim, but one of the ones is called Moedim B'Halacha, which kind of is a halachic overview of all the Yamim Tovim with Rishonim and Achreinim, and it's a very good way of just getting an overview of all of the fundamental issues. And because Rav Zevin was a Zionist, the last chapter of Moedim B'Halacha is the new holiday of Yom HaTzmaut, which he also describes as a holiday that needs to be celebrated. Now, Moedim B'Halacha is such a beautiful book. It really is a beautiful book that Art Scroll wanted to translate it in English. And it's called The Festivals in Halacha, 2 volumes. And they left out the last chapter without indicating that there was a deletion. They just left it out. All right, so most people didn't notice. Most people who bought the English that never knew the Hebrew, and the people who had the Hebrew didn't look at the English. But somebody noticed and said, hey, where's the Yom HaTzmaut chapter? So what was Art Scroll's teretz? They gave a teretz. It's a davar pasha to us that if Rav Zevin would be alive today and see what's happened to the Medina, he certainly wouldn't have agreed Okay, whatever it is. Now again, if Art Scroll feels that the hashkafa of Das Torah is keneged Yom Ha'atzmaut, let him put in a footnote. Let him say Rav Seven had a certain shita, the Brisker Rav, the Chazal, whoever you want to put, didn't agree with it. That's fine. But what gives you reshus to take something out of a mechaber sefer without even indicating there was a deletion? So that's another. I'm just giving you examples of this. Another example you mentioned with the Nitziv. The Orach Hashulchan's son, Rav Baruch Halevi Epstein, he wrote the Torah Tamima, which is a very beautiful sefer, although it's a little controversial. He wrote a 4-volume biography of his family, and the 4th volume is about the Nitziv. The Nitziv was his uncle. And, there's a famous, it's makubal in the Olam of Yeshivos, that Volozhin was closed because the Russian government demanded secular studies, and the Nitziv was machriya, better not to have a yeshiva than have limud echol. And that's been passed down as a mesora for 150 years. The Torah Tamima says, he was in Volozhin at the time, he says, that's not exactly what happens. He says, the Nitziv was happy to have an hour or 2 hours a day of secular studies. At least, but he would have accepted it. But the Russian government said, you can only have learning till 1 in the afternoon. And the afternoon has to be devoted legamri to secular studies, and the yeshiva had to be closed after 5. That's a totally different picture. I mean, they're basically telling you you can learn from 9 to 12:30, and that's it. No afternoon, no night. So at that point, the Nitziv says they might as well go to a beis medrash or something. In other words, this changed the whole story. This is not the Nitziv saying we can't have any limud echol. This was the Russian government wanted 6 hours of limud echol. That the Nitziv says it's not kedai to have a yeshiva. Now, what's interesting is I remember this like yesterday. It was such an amazing thing. The Lakewood Cheder sent out this translation of the part of this book. It was called My Uncle the Nitziv. Very, very interesting. Just interesting. The whole thing is interesting. And then a few weeks later, we get a letter from the Lakewood Cheder that says, please send the book back, we will give you a full refund. It's come to our attention that this book is keneged Das Torah, and there are statements in the book that are keneged the mesora. We deeply regret sending you a book that contains non-kosher ideas. Well, rest assured, you get a letter like that, you're going to read the book really carefully. What on earth are they talking about? They didn't say what they were talking about. What on earth is in here, right? If anything, you're going to read the book. So it turned out there were three things they didn't like. You mentioned one of them. One was the Torah Tamima mentions, and he knew the Nitziv. He was the Nitziv's nephew, very close to the Nitziv. He says that the Nitziv used to read newspapers, Yiddish newspapers, every Shabbos. That was part of his Einik Shabbos. Of course, the Nitziv also learned Maseches Shabbos and Ervin every Shabbos. So after he finished Maseches Shabbos and Ervin, he would read the paper a little bit. That's what he said. And the second thing was that the Nitziv's first wife, the Nitziv's Rebbetzin, used to learn Gemara. And there's a whole chapter that she complained, why can't women learn Gemara, etc. And the third was the idea that the Nitziv was maskim to a certain amount of limudei chol, as long as it wasn't excessive. And that's keneged the yeshiva world today. We have to, you couldn't censor it. The book was already translated. They would have censored it, but they said, not a kosher book, can't read it anymore, etc. And I can give so many examples. Rav Nassim Kamenetsky, Zechorno Livracha, who just was nifter last year, he was Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky's son, and he wrote a beautiful, beautiful biography of his father, and not just his father, but the whole Slobodka yeshiva world, Rav Aaron Kotler and Rav Yitzchak Kutner. And Rav Nassim himself was a Rosh Yeshiva. And they wrote about Rav Yaakov, and that book got banned. It got put into Cherem. Why? Because he writes that Rav Aaron Kotler used to read Dostoevsky in Russian, and whatever it would be. This can't be. Now, Rav Nassim's taina was, he wanted people to understand that people who became Gedolim also had struggles and issues and nisyanis, and they weren't like born as super geniuses who were totally righteous. They had issues. Even girlfriends. Things like that. And he wanted people to understand this because he felt this would be a chizuk, right? It's a much bigger chizuk if I see somebody, a great person who had struggles that I'm going through, than to simply have somebody who is described as superhuman, right? But there were people who felt, can't do that. You cannot portray these weaknesses or these chesronos or whatever they are, if they are chesronos. Therefore, the book was banned. I remember making of a gadol you could get for $25. And when they banned it, the book was no longer available, but some people put their copies on eBay for $1,000, whatever it would be. They could make money on it, because once the book is banned, you can't get it. Now the truth is, you can actually get it online. I don't want to be Ivra and Lifnei Ivra. It is a fascinating book. All right, so all of this is censorship, and then we have other examples where you can write a book on this. Actually, one person did write a book on this. Mark Shapiro wrote a book on things that are censored. Is of course the debate about Natan. Used to be Nosan, now he's Natan Slifkin, who used to teach in Or Sameach many years ago, more than 10 years ago. And Rabbi Slifkin tried to deal with conflicts between Chazal and science and resolve them in different ways. And his mahalech, I'm simplifying, was that on halacha, Chazal are definitive. On science, they know the best science of their time, but they could be mistaken on science, etc. Now, his books initially had haskamos of very chashuva people. Rav Shmuel Kamenetsky gave those books a haskama. Rav Aaron Lapiansky, a very chashuva person, maybe some of you have met him, Rosh Yeshiva in Silver Spring, he's from Mir, wrote a haskama. Many chashuva people considered those books to be good books, but there were Kanoim who wanted the books banned, and the books were condemned. And unfortunately what happened was Rabbi Slifkin kind of reacted, the reaction really, in other words, sometimes in a little bit of a disrespectful way, and that made it even worse, etc., etc., etc. I'm sorry I'm so long-winded tonight. So you're right, there's a long history of censorship. The truth of the matter is, I am against it. I am absolutely against it. It's true that there are ideas that are kfira, ideas of apikorsis, but when you're dealing with machloksim in hashkafa, then there's no reason why these ideas should not be presented. People say, for example, Slifkin's ideas, just to take a mashal, are going to undermine faith in Chazal. People will not look at Chazal with respect if you talk about the fact that they might be mistaken. Well, what about the opposite idea? If I'm told I have to accept every statement of Chazal as the literal truth, then when they say it takes 7 years for a nachash to give birth to an offspring, and I'm told I have to believe that, and I know that that's not emes, at least in a literal way, so is that going to increase my respect for Chazal, or is that going to decrease my respect for Chazal? Masha engin, if I'm told, okay, science is science, biology is biology, but that doesn't take away from Chazal's godless of Torah. So then I could live with that. I could say, Chazal are holy and sacrosanct within the sphere of Torah. In other words, fakir, are you protecting kavod chachamim, or are you undermining kavod chachamim? So censorship may actually make it much, much worse. If you have an approach, for example, I don't want to get into too many things because now that things are on Torah anytime, so the whole world is ready to give me a kick if they don't like what I say. But let's imagine that somebody has an approach to make evolution compatible with Torah. So one person might say, Chas v'shalom, that's not our mesora, we have to say there's no such thing. Okay. Now, what does that do to the person, though, who studied science and who is convinced, rightly or wrongly, I'm not defending evolution, but he's convinced evolution is true. But he's told a believing Jew cannot believe in evolution? So the only choice you're giving him is to be a kafir. Masha ein kain. If it could be understood that even within Torah, such a position is possible, that's giving the person the chance to remain Bishlomei Emunah Yisrael. Right? So this is where censorship breaks down. You think, or not you, but people think by censoring ideas, you're protecting Kedusha in Klal Yisrael. When in fact, what often can happen is, by censoring ideas, you're giving people no choice but to leave when they could have had a way of remaining within the frum world. So I am very much against censorship of those ideas. Now again, debate. You want to debate evolution? You want to tell me evolution is not proven? There are holes in evolution. Go ahead. Seder kachi darka shel Torah. To take ideas, to debate them, to slug them up, to show why they're wrong. That's absolutely legitimate. I'm not a big supporter of evolution. But to simply censor and not discuss. Now, I'll tell you a Maisa, something I had a discussion once with Rav Weinbach. He and Rav Schiller were the founding Rosh Hashivas. Rav Weinbach is a cardinal Livracha. This is when I started teaching in Or.edu, and I was teaching Hashkafic history. I think for some reason Torah Anytime put it up now. I don't know why. It's many years ago already. And we talked about Zionism, we talked about this and that. So in those days, I don't know, maybe the students were more zealous. Somebody registered a complaint against me that I'm teaching, happy courses or whatever it is. So I'm not sure if I've become more conventional or the students are less zealous than they used to be. But in those days, somebody reported me. So I spoke to Rav Weinbach about it. And Rav Weinbach told me an interesting thing. And when I first heard it, I was shocked. But then, I think about it, and it's something I'm still shocked with, but it's very interesting. He said, you and I both know that the world is a complicated place, and issues are not always black and white, and there's a lot of grays, and things that people think are all bad are not really all bad, and there's some good in them. But he said, sometimes we have to present things black and white because grays are too confusing for people when they first get involved in Judaism. They need clear guidelines. Now, you can have two reactions to this. And again, I hope Rav Weinbach will be meichel me because I say this again with deep, deep respect and really love for Rav Weinbach. You could say, that sounds really good, or you could be outraged. You can have two different reactions to this. His point is a strong point. His point is a strong point. It is not an illegitimate point. People get confused with nuances. And therefore, the world of censorship comes out of this idea. We don't want to give people shades of gray. We need to give them clarity. That's Shita. On the other hand, that Shita is at the expense of truth. Truth is often going to be gray. In Zionism, there's good, there's bad. It's not like totally in the army, good and bad, right? But sometimes, Rav Weinbach argued, you got to be clear. And I hear. Again, maybe I'm too much introspecting here, but I hear the point, and this is kind of a long answer of censorship, but I disagree with it at the same time, even though I understand its force. And by the way, Rav Schwab, Zichrono Livracha, said the same thing. There's a quote from Rav Schwab that's astounding. He basically talked about history, that the history of our Gedolim should not be presented accurately necessarily. We should only present the positive things. Why do we have to hear every Maisa of this and every Maisa of that and every controversy and every machloket? Putting aside Lashon Hara even, he says, history is supposed to be inspirational and didactic. It's supposed to teach you things. And we don't need to get into all of that. Rav Schwab is essentially endorsing censorship for the purpose of bringing people to a better place. So, a complicated issue. Right? I'm trying to be very, very honest, and maybe I'm crossing the line a little bit. But this is again, I see it as two legitimate mahalchim. There is an argument for censorship, and there's also an argument against censorship. Yeah.
Why is the censorship not connected to Chazal when you have a lot of Gemaras saying things that they publish about?
Say again, things that what?
Chazal say a lot of things in the Gemara that stories about.
That's a very good, that's a very good point. Did Chazal censor? You open up a Gemara, you have Gemaras about everything, different opinions, even opinions that we would call apikorsis. There's an Amman Diomer in Sanhedrin, Rebbe Hillel, not Hillel Hazakin, but Rebbe Hillel. Ein Mashiach Yisrael. There's no such thing as Mashiach. He got killed already. He got killed in Chizkiyahu's time. There's no Mashiach. What are you talking about? Right? Now imagine a Rosh Hashiva would get up today and say, Mashiach, he's long gone. He ain't coming back. They would put him in Cherem. Right? So your point is very well taken, that Chazal didn't seem to go with the mahalech of censorship that much. They wanted things to be discussed. Now, in defense, the argument would be that in Yeridas Hadairos, as the generations get spiritually inferior, we sometimes have to be stronger. It's like circle the wagons mentality. When the whole world is going to neged the Torah, we have to be extra strong and extra firm and extra stark. And we can't allow, it's called slippery slope, we can't allow any type of concession to those other ideas, lest it's going to pull us down. Maybe it could be get a harchaka, Yeah, so Chazal, were able to deal with it, and once Chazal dealt with it, so we can incorporate it, but we shouldn't go weiter. We shouldn't follow that mahalech, because that mahalech is dangerous. Yeah.
In Lecha Dodi, it says SHAMOR v'ZACHOR b'dibur echad.
Yeah.
But in the Torah, it says ZACHOR and then SHAMOR. Why did that decision get made?
Okay, excellent question. And I'm going to give you a very balabatish answer. It's true that in Parshas Yisrael, the fourth commandment of the Ten Commandments says ZACHOR, remember Shabbos. In Parshas V'eschanan, SHAMOR, observe Shabbos. ZACHOR is the positive of making kiddush and eating a meal, and SHAMOR is not doing the malachos. That's the difference. And which did Hashem say? Hashem said them at the same time in a way that we can't imagine. We hear SHAMOR v'ZACHOR b'dibur echad. So your question is, it should say ZACHOR v'SHAMOR b'dibur echad. Answer: the author of Lecha Dodi is Rav Shlomo Halevi Alkabatz, and the stanzas of Lecha Dodi spell out his name, Shlomo Halevi, and then Boi B'Shalom is the conclusion. And since the first letter of his name is Shlomo, the first verse had to begin with a shin, so he had a problem. He couldn't start it with ZACHOR v'SHAMOR. It had to be SHAMOR v'ZACHOR. Sometimes that's the answer. It's not a lumdish, a deep answer, but stylistically, the poetry required that it be written that way. Yeah.
With regards to Lecha Dodi, I know there are some customs by Jews in Eretz Yisrael specifically, or I guess more in Yerushalayim, that they cut out certain verses, or in Lecha Dodi, meaning they read certain parts. I've heard about the part of that.
Are you talking about every Friday night? There are those that on Yom Tov, when Shabbos...
Every Friday night.
Wow, I have to admit, I have not heard that. Now, it is true. Well, I'll tell you I'll tell you what the issue is. The issue is that more than half of Lecha Dodi is really about Avelis. It talks about Mikdash Melech Melucha. It talks about Hafecha. It talks about destruction. It says, wake up, from your darkness. So some feel that that's an expression of Avelos on Shabbos, and it would not be proper to do. So they'll do SHAMOR v'ZACHOR, they'll do Likras Shabbos, and then maybe they'll do Yaminus Multifrotzi and Boi B'Shalom. They will cut out all of the references to the destruction of Yerushalayim, because there's a certain sadness that is connected to that. That would be the svara. But I wasn't aware that they actually, you say there's Sephardic minyanim that don't do it?
And most Sephardi Yerushalmi Jews do, yeah.
I'm saying they do it, they don't do it?
They do it.
They do it, yeah.
They take it out. Yeah.
Okay, they take it out. Okay.
Yeah, Syrian community takes it out.
Okay, so that would be the reason. The reason would be those are. On Yom Tov, I said the minhag I'm familiar with is that when Friday night is a Yom Tov, they don't say it. Yeah, but you're saying even on a regular Friday night. But that would be the Indian is it might be called Avelus b'Shabbos. Yeah.
So I'm trying to clarify a point. So we know that Rebbe wrote the Mishnayos,
Yeah.
but the mesora continued. So
Yeah.
once it came down to the Gemara, how do we explain the machlokets if there was the mesora from Rebbe and onwards?
Well, when you say a mesora, I mean like this. Yehuda HaNasi wrote down the Mishnah, and that was makubal by all of the chachamim of the time as the statement of Torah Shebal Peh. But then, like everything else, the Mishnah is debated, and there's going to be machloket on how to understand the Mishnah. And for that, we didn't necessarily have a mesora, meaning we didn't have a mesora as to what the Mishnah meant. The Mishnah was given as a text, and memela it was left to the chachamim of the new generations, the Amoraim, to expound what that text means. So they kind of created almost a new mesora, meaning there's the mesora of the Amoraim that was not the same as the mesora of the Tanoim, or the Tanoim themselves had different views as to what the Mishnah meant.
So what did they do themselves? Like the people after Rebbe and how, I'm confused how it didn't get passed down.
Well, how the Mishnah got passed down?
So how once the Mishnah was written down,
Yeah.
how the people, the Jews who in the generation, how they confused.
No, so what you had is this. Once the Mishnah is written down, we have a Mishnah. So the Mishnah as a text was learnt in all of the yeshivos, in Bavel and in Eretz Yisrael. Those were the two countries that had yeshivos. And there were hundreds of people learning the Mishnayos, hundreds of teachers. And each Rebbe would teach the Mishnah, and then the Talmidim would ask questions, and there would be answers and explanations. In some yeshivos, they explained it this way. In some yeshivos, they explained it this way. I think I described it as, and people made notes, private notes, and that went on for hundreds of years in different places. And the halacha was different in different places, based on how the Rebbeim came out with their understanding of the Mishnah. And then, hundreds of years later, by the time it's Ravina and Rav Ashi, he gathers together all of those notes, all of those explanations, and goes through them, which are right, which are wrong. Should we keep all of the explanations, only some of the explanations? And therefore, it was not a single mesora at that point, meaning to say, after Rebbe, it gets passed down through many, 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 many teachers, and then it gets consolidated. I mean, imagine like it goes horizontal, but then it narrows down to Ravina and Rav Ashi, taking all of these different mesoras, and then combining it.
That's the Gemara.
That's the Gemara, yeah.
And they felt the need to write it down for the same reason.
Same reason, because at some point you had a huge amount of material, and there was a fear it would be forgotten. If you try to imagine, we talked about this. If you try to imagine the composition of the Gemara, how amazingly complicated it is. You have to understand that the Gemara is written as if it's a continuous discussion, but it's not really. In other words, there's kind of a question is asked, and then this answer is given. The truth is, Ravina and Rav Ashi kind of took the question from this base medrash, and took the answer from this base medrash, and the answer was not necessarily said as an answer to this question. Ravina and Rav Ashi were masader it to be an answer to that question. Right? So they're kind of taking from many, many different mesoras, and they're kind of deciding, when I say they, the chachamim of that generation. And the reason is because there was a fear of it being forgotten, of it being lost. Yeah?
Sometimes I think that we won't pass them like a Mishnah. So when that happens,
So when we don't posken like a Mishnah, it's almost always the case that an Amira cannot argue with the Tanach, except maybe Rav, a few people. So it's always a case of following another Tanach, following a Brisa. Now the question becomes, okay, granted, when you follow a Brisa, you're following another Tanach. But l'chayra, if Rav Yehuda HaNasi only put in some Tanoim in the Mishnah, and didn't put in other Tanoim in the Mishnah, there is a decision of the Chachamim of that generation, which were actually a Sanhedrin, that the Halacha, in other words, if the Mishnah gives you a machloket, So the Mishnah is telling you, we're not necessarily telling you the halacha. But if the Mishnah does not bring in another opinion, the Mishnah is telling you we don't posken like that opinion. So l'chayra, there's a hachra'ah of Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi and the Sanhedrin that we don't follow that Tana that's in a brisa or whatever it is. And if that's the case, what gives an Amayra the right to resuscitate, to bring, granted, an Amayra can't argue with a Tana. So, but even if he's following a Tana, that Tana was nitcha, was pushed away by the hachra of the Mishnah. So how is that? That's your question. It is a very good question. I mean, I raised it in some of our Rishonim. I didn't have a clear answer. The only answer I could give is, although I can't even explain this, is omission is lav dafka a psak, meaning he didn't bring it in, but he didn't definitively reject it. So the question is, why didn't he bring it in? You're going to have a problem. Because the chayra, if there was a definitive rejection, it wouldn't have been shaykh for an Amayra to then go back. It's like we would say, oh, I'm not arguing with the Gemara, I'm just poskening like Beit Shammai. I mean, I can't go back and say, I want to posken like Beit Shammai, because the Mishnah itself says, halacha is like Beit Hillel, right? So it's a good kasha. But I'm not giving you a full answer at all, but I just want to emphasize, it's never an Amayra just stam as I arguing, it's always being connected to a Tana, but as I say, even with that being true, you still have a good kasha. Yeah.
Throughout Tanach and especially in Chazal, we see like different ages that are given, different ages that different Torah personalities were when they did certain things. Like, for example, like there's a common Chazal people say like Rivka was like 3 when she got her Yitzchak.
Yeah.
Or like how the Gemara says, I think the Gemara that Esau was 13.
Yeah.
When he was, and like how Tanach says how like
Yeah.
I think it was King Yoshio maybe was like maybe like very very young also when he came.
Well, Yoshio is not a good raya because the Tanakh itself says he was 8 years old. I mean, Yoshio is in the Nevi'im itself. Yeah, yeah, right.
Are these meant to be taken literally? Are they allegoric?
Yeah. So first of all, I guess people always say, "Oh, Rivka 3, that's so ridiculous." You listen. Go across the street to the supermarket here. You see 4-year-old kids, schlepping milk along. So the truth of the matter is, the old idea that an American kid, doesn't, can't walk to school until they're 25 or something. Other cultures don't have the prolonged infantilization that we spoiled American people have. Again, whatever. I don't know if everyone's here from the United States or whatever it is. So it's not so difficult to hear that you could be very young and do things. But the emes is, in a lot of these inyonim, it is shaykh for there to be symbolic meanings. It's hard to know. Meaning to say, Maharal says in a lot of Agadata, and the Rambam actually said it even earlier, everything Chazal say is emes, but sometimes Chazal communicated spiritual emes through mishalim and parables. And when you talk about somebody being 3, you're referring to a certain character of a 3-year-old that a person might have, or 14, or whatever it would be. So we're not meshubad, at least when Chazal give ages, to assume that everything is literal. First of all, in the case of Rivka, there's actually a machloket, right? Some say she was 3, some say she was 14. Taisus and Yavamas brings 14. Now, if you say, Eilu v'Eilu, Divrei Elokim Chayim, all of the views are right, how is that possible? This is a Metzias. So the answer is symbolically. She had aspects of a 3-year-old, aspects of a 14-year-old, and then you have to explain what is the aspect of a 3-year-old, what is the aspect of a 14-year-old. So again, if you look in Maharal, you'll constantly see that he uses this as metaphors for certain characterizations in Ruchnius. So if that makes it easier for you, you could possibly learn that way. Yeah.
This question was sent in.
Yeah.
If you're sitting in shachris Shabbos morning, and a person you know to have been born a woman sits down next to you, what should you do?
Wow. Yeah, these are not theoretical hechitimsis today. These are real questions, tragically, that we are facing. In fact, I gave a talk for Or Sameach, of all places, on transgender issues. You wouldn't think it's an Or Sameach type of topic, but in fact, it was such a prevalent issue that they wanted, the yeshiva itself wanted to have a talk on this issue. So first of all, let's talk about the status of. I'm not dealing is it permissible or not permissible, but achar hamaisa. If a woman goes through a surgical and hormonal procedure to become a man, and now the woman looks like a man, and the woman identifies as a man, what is the halachic status of this person? Is this person a woman? Or is this person a man, right? That's the first question. So here's the emes. Most poskim do say that gender is irrevocable. Gender is unchangeable, meaning you are the gender you were born with. So if a person is anatomically born a woman and changes to a man, in the eyes of halacha, they are still a woman and would not have to put on tefillin and the like. So, according to that shita, which indeed is most opinions, if a man who is born a woman sits next to me, I am sitting next to a woman. Okay, so the question then becomes, as a practical matter, do I have to get out of there because there's no mechitza and the like? So this is tricky. Some poskim say like this: yeah, she is a woman, but she's a woman towards which you will not have hirhurim or sexual attraction because she looks like a man. Therefore, since the whole union of mechitza is to avoid, sexual thoughts, in such a situation you don't have sexual thoughts, and therefore it would be mutter. Okay, that's one heter. But let me just point out that the Tzitz Eliezer of Waldenberg, he is a das yochid. He's a das yochid here. He actually says that the Torah recognizes, not the permissibility, it's not allowed to do it, but the Torah recognizes b'di'evet, after it's done, that gender transformations are indeed valid. And according to him, if a person born a woman transitions to a man, that person is indeed a man for Torah purposes, would have to put on tefillin, could even be counted for a minyan, and there wouldn't be any problem at all. It's like Rabbi Oldenburg, there wouldn't be any BAKOL problem. I'm sitting next to a halachic man. Now let me point out yet a final point on this. Again?
He becomes part of mitzvahs?
Yes, it would be the opposite. Yeah, if it's a man becomes a woman, he doesn't have to wear tefillin anymore. And also that also means his marriage to his wife doesn't need a get. The marriage is nifka, because he's now become a woman, like the Tzitz Eliezer. Right, a man married to a woman who becomes a woman, his wife is no longer married to him. Right? Okay. But that's only like Rav Oldenburg, like the other opinions. The woman would have to give him a get. Yeah.
It's another derech.
Another derech kainas atzma by transgender surgery. Yeah. Now I just want to point out that this machlokes, Paiskim and Rav and Tzitz Eliezer, is only talking about man to woman, woman to man. If a person is a true hermaphrodite, bisexual, which Chazal call an androgynous, they're the same word even in English. So by an androgynous, we do actually posken that he can be assigned a gender. Well, not that he's allowed, again, I'm not saying mutter, but if he or she, well, whatever you call it, if the androgynous person is made a ZACHOR or a nekeva, that will be their identity, because since they didn't have a definitive gender, it's shaykh. Again, this is an issue. Androgynous is a real, it's not Baruch Hashem, it's not a big problem. It's not like there are thousands of kids with this problem, but there is an issue. There is androgynous that does, and androgynous does exist. There is such a thing. In fact, Johns Hopkins Hospital, from the Baltimore area, has what's called a sex reassignment clinic that is the world's center for kind of doing this surgery for people who are androgynous and the like. So for the small number of people that have it, it is actually a very, very serious serious type of problem. Of course, it's crazy though. With the mishugas of the world, it's not a problem anymore, because you now have, it's not just transgenders. See, the world gets crazier every day. You know, it's almost like, oh, the old shaila about somebody's child being gay, like that's old hat. That's like, you know, that's simple stuff. So we move from gay and lesbian to transgender. Okay, that's worse. And now it's no longer transgender. It's, what is it, postgender or non-gender or non-binary, they call it? Non-binary. I don't want to be identified. It. I want to be an it. In fact, somebody sent me a letter from England that a person who was anatomically a girl but identifies as non-binary, she wants to attend a bas mitzvah of her classmate, but she says she's not comfortable being seated with the women or being seated with the men. So what does she? I don't know what she wants. She wants her own section of. She says that she doesn't want to be assigned a gender. I don't even hear exactly what is being requested here. She says because she is beyond gender. Kind of like a Kodesh Baruch Hu. Talk about arrogance, right? You say, God, the Ribono Shel Olam is indeed non-binary. That's emes. That's taka emes. But unless you're God, everybody has some identity there. So in truth, according to that shita, androgynous is not a problem. Androgynous is the Adam HaSholem. You're non-binary. You're both. But l'maisa, for normal people, it is a serious problem, and you are allowed to assign an identity to an androgynous. Yeah.
I know the kids under 13 are not chayv mitzvahs.
Yeah.
Is that going to be assumed that they're chayv in middos? Because we know that comes before Torah.
Yeah, that's a very excellent question. Are children below 13 or girls below 12 who are not obligated in mitzvos, are they obligated in middos? After all, it says derech eretz. Derech eretz is kind of refinement of character. Kodma l'Torah, precedes Torah, so you're offering a chiddush, a little bit of a new explanation. Maybe it means it kicks in earlier than mitzvahs. Halachically, that happens not to be the case. Now, kodma is referring to qualitative importance. The derech eretz is even more important, but technically, a child that's a katan has no obligations. Now, once again, though, I, as a parent, have an obligation called chinuch, training, and it is important, your point is very important, that part of chinuch is training children in middos, not just in technical mitzvahs. So absolutely, I train a child in middos from as young an age as I possibly can, but technically it's not a chiyuv on the child. It's a chiyuv on the parent to raise the child. By the way, the Chazon Ish talks about the idea that bad middos are much more contagious than lack of religion. In other words, the example would be this. Sometimes you hear, this is something that comes up in our Sameach a lot. People get married and their parents are not religious, and they say, I don't want my child to hang around my parents that much because they're not so from whatever it would be, and I want to therefore maybe create a certain distance. But the truth of the matter is, if the grandparents are people who are balei middos, who are good, kind, honest people, then there's less of a danger of the kids going in the wrong way than it is with frum people who don't have good middos. In other words, we sometimes worry about the wrong thing. I worry that my parents, don't keep glat, or I worry that my parents eat heteromechira produce of Shemitah. I can't let my kids be involved. So I only want my kid to be involved with the frummest of the frum. But sometimes, Baruch Hashem, there are many, many wonderful frummest of the frum who are great balei middos. I'm not creating a slander. But sometimes it can be that all of those real frum, maybe they're not so good in middos. And the Chazon Ish says the kilkul from bad middos can be more destructive than the kilkul of maybe not the maximum level of frumkeit. So we have to pay very careful attention to the middos. Yeah.
I remember reading in somewhere in Breitowitz that Hashem blessed Avraham BAKOL, and then there's machloket in the Gemara. he didn't have any daughters. He had daughters.
Right.
He had a daughter whose name was BAKOL.
BAKOL, yeah.
And I remember reading the Ibn Ezra says throws away that pshat in the Gemara on grammar on the grammar of it.
Right.
And the Ramban blasts him for it. But what gives the right for the Ibn Ezra to use his grammar to override the pshat in the
Right.
Gemara? Not the pshat
Right.
in the Gemara, but an opinion in the Gemara.
Right. So first of all, the two opinions of the Gemara itself is very interesting. Hashem gave Avraham the ultimate blessing, everything. So one says, he had a daughter too. The other says, Baruch Hashem, he didn't have a daughter. The blessing was he didn't have a daughter. So again, you could read that, anti-daughter, what's going on? No, about it not. About it just means that with a daughter there was so much worrying, so much daiga, so much concern, God forbid, particularly in a corrupt society like Canaan, somebody could rape her just like by Dinah. So one could understand in the context that a daughter would be a dangerous thing in a corrupt, immoral society. Okay, but you're not asking about the Etzem Drasha, you're asking about the Ibn Ezra. So the truth of the matter is, it's very, very fascinating. The Ibn Ezra is one of the Rishonim. The Ibn Ezra is a Chashava Rishon. In fact, the Ibn Ezra is even quoted by Tosfos in Maseches Rosh Hashanah about Rabbeinu Tam interacted with the Ibn Ezra and the like. But the Ibn Ezra was, I'm not being disrespectful, a bit of a maverick. The Ibn Ezra was a very, very independent person, and he was an expert in a lot of things, but dikduk was one of the things that he was very, very bucky in, and he argues with Chazal all the time. Now, the Ramban in the Hakdama to his commentary on Chumash, the Ramban addresses his predecessors, which were Rashi and the Ibn Ezra, and says, Rashi, holy of holies, Kodesh Kedoshim, all I have is kavod and admiration. With the Ibn Ezra, he applies the pasuk in Mishlei that says, Tochacha Megula Ava Musuteret. That means open rebuke, hidden love. I love the guy, but I'm going to rebuke him all the time. And the primary rebuke basically is that Ibn Ezra had a certain freedom to kind of disagree with Chazal. But here's the thing. The Ibn Ezra himself says that he will never disagree with Chazal on any interpretation of a pasuk that is relevant to halacha. That if Chazal say, for example, eye for an eye means payment, even if grammatically or literally eye for an eye means you knock out the eye, Ibn Ezra says when it comes to halacha, Chazal have the final word, and I'm only going to differ with them when it comes to explaining the pasuk. Now you're asking, how can he do even that? So the truth of the matter is, the Ibn Ezra is not the only one who does that. The Taisus Yomtiv, one of the great, great commentaries on the Mishnah, actually writes that we have rishus, even if it's keneged Chazal, as long as it does not affect a halacha. So the truth is, that was makubal. And I'll tell you the truth, the Ibn Ezra does it all the time, that's emes. But the truth is, the Ramban does it sometimes as well, and less than the Ramban, but even Rashi does it sometimes. So everybody does it. Rashi, all Rishonim do it, but the Ibn Ezra does it all the time. And that's why the Ramban is saying you have to have a little more covered for Chazal than you have. That was the teichacha that the Ramban had. But again, the important point was, in fact, I mentioned earlier the Rashbam offered an interpretation, Keneged Chazal, that Art Scroll censored. But the point is, all of the Rishonim say, on matters of halacha, we don't have rishus. Yeah.
There's one thing to say, offer a new understanding that's different from Chazal than to say Chazal your own.
Well, the way you understand it is this. Okay, I have to look at the exact words of the Ibn Ezra. I don't think the Ibn Ezra saying Chazal are wrong, but it's kind of saying, based on our knowledge of dikduk, this would not be correct. But the assumption would be Chazal would have either a different understanding of dikduk or an answer to the question. I think it's legitimate for us to say, as kind of as a tzorech, that based on our understanding of dikduk, this would not follow. But not that they're wrong, but just that type of kasha. Okay? Yeah.
Just to follow up on the example given about the parents who are not as strong as maybe others and keeping distance to them with the those parents who don't even keep Shabbos or,
Okay, so again, I want to clarify myself a little bit. I didn't mean to say that if the grandparents are going to give the kid treif and if they're going to make him be machal Shabbos, that you put your kid in that environment. Of course you do not. I'm referring to parents who, even if they're not personally religious, they will accommodate themselves to the needs of your children, meaning they will only give your children kosher foods. They will not, I mean, maybe in their own room they'll watch TV, but they will, that's a separate thing, but they will not, make your child do anything that's keneged halacha. So that's what I'm referring to. In other words, I mean, of course, you don't put your kid in an environment where the Torah is going to be broken. But in many, many cases, even non-religious grandparents are, if they're given the rules, if they're given the guidance, if they're given the instructions, they will try to work it out. And at that point, if they're good people, it's not kedai to make a distance between your children and their grandparents. That wouldn't be a good thing. But HaKol L'Fi Yo'inyan, it would certainly depend. If you have sometimes you have someone who tries to sabotage. If they deeply resent, right? If they deeply resent that you're from, so they may make it a point, I'm going to give him treif. Again, it sounds devious, right? Sometimes you have that, so that unfortunately you may have to avoid. But most of the time it's not that way. Yeah. Any last questions? Then we'll break. Okay, thanks a lot. And,